Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. Thanks for understanding why I had to skip last week's. Retro World Expo was an absolute blast, but there would have been no time for me to do this and give it the time that I like to spend on it. I never blow off these Q&As or just skim through them. I really just try to have an open conversation, laid back as if we were hanging out somewhere like an expo. So I didn't want to rush through it. So thanks very much for for being cool about me skipping a week, and let's jump in and see what we got. First up, over on Floatplane, Aman wants to know if there's any way to implement TapTo on original hardware. Would it be nice to just have an NFC tag embedded in a cartridge or CD case and have flash cards or ODEs read them and launch the specific game? This could give the tactile nostalgia kick while using and preserving original hardware. I think that's a cool idea, but that's something that would have to be implemented into the ROM card itself. So, for example, Crix would have to do a redesign and then implement some kind of NFC reader into it and then have the code set up so that you would then have to somehow program the full path. So it is theoretically possible. I'm just not really sure that that's something Crix would do. And I'm not sure how many people would adopt something like that, because the one advantage of original hardware is if you do have your original carts, you just plug them in, which is not something that's at all possible on Mister. So I think that's a very cool idea, but that would be way more complicated than just plugging a TapTo reader into the USB port of an EverDrive or something like that. But I like it. So, anybody who has ideas like this, keep them coming, because some of the craziest ones have been implemented over the years. But my guess is no, that's not something we're going to see, but still a very cool thing to think about. Now, moving over to Patreon, Danny Funker said they're not sure if I'm aware of the inner workings of FFV1, which is a codec that was designed for archival purposes. And I'm not really fully versed in exactly how it's different from the others and why you would use it. And in fact, I would really love to have a conversation with a deep dive expert type of person on why something like that would be better or worse than Lagarith or X264 lossless or any of those others. I have my guesses, but without doing a deep dive myself into it, I don't want to just word vomit guesses that may not even be slightly true. However, Danny Funker found a video about that shows somebody who does definitely seem to know how it works, and even talks about how the slices work for FFV1. So I plan on watching the whole video. I just watched that little clip, which of course I'll leave in the description for anybody that wants to watch it themselves. But that might be exactly where I need to start to kind of dig into this stuff. Now, the one thing I will say, and this is a guess, but this is an educated guess, and that in my testing over the years, converting between lossless formats, assuming you don't mess anything up or change a setting or anything, but if you correctly convert between them, I have never seen data loss at all. So what I would really like to know first, is there any advantage into recording into FFV1 versus into Lagarith? And I still use lags just because it's never once failed on me for any, assuming that I had all the settings right and everything, it's never once failed on me. So if there is a reason to start encoding from VHS or whatever into FFV1, I would like to definitely know that. And if not, then I'm going to stick with lags for the short term at least, because it's free, it's fast, it works. But you never know. And I've definitely had some issues with FFV1 as far as compatibility goes. So I think I've learned some tricks to make it more compatible, even if it's just things like saving it in the QuickTime container, the MOV container. But I don't know. I'll look more into it, but I'm obviously very into this stuff lately. So maybe you all will sell me on FFV1, or maybe I'll continue to use my, grumpy old man, going to do it the way I've always done it type of thing. But I'm always open and I always want to learn and try to get better. So I'll watch that video eventually, and I appreciate you sharing it with us all. Next up, two things from Quantum Guitar. First, following up on a discussion from a while back about getting the SNES digital audio mod working on their setup, they ended up sending it back to the modder who worked with QWERTY to track down a bad ground, and that's what resolved the issue. So that is awesome, and that's good news for everybody too, because I thought that a lot of those chips, especially the ones from the QWERTY boards, were a lot more compatible than some of the original mods that were done. So that's good. I'm glad that was all fixed. But also, Quantum Guitar said they also had the C11 capacitor ghosting fix implemented, but they're still getting ghosting. So what I would actually recommend is try to get a different cap for it. then. Usually the capacitor that you used should be fine. However, there's one that's a little more accurate that's just an odd size, so you almost never get it on DigiKey or any of those other websites. So this is a 0.33 UF cap, 330 NF. So you could try that one and see, and it's fairly easy if you want to replace the existing cap with that one, not stack it on top. But I think there's a bunch of misinformation about that, which is accidental. Some people don't realize that you could stack the capacitor as well as remove it. To get it perfect, you might need a slightly different value depending on which, but I would remove the original. I would put this one in its place, and it's cheap. It's like $3 for a 2-pack or something like that, and see what happens. Unfortunately, though, there's always going to be something with a one chip, which is why the upcoming Voltar mod could potentially be the best solution, because there's always going to be some kind of trade-off with analog video. It's just not possible. And in fact, there's also a trade-off with pure digital, because you don't have any of the analog warmth on the audio side, yada, yada, yada. There's no such thing as absolute perfection. So you have to just decide what drives you the least crazy. So I would spend the money, the $2 on that, and hopefully you'd be able to figure out just how to replace that one cap. It's both easy and tricky at the same time. It's tricky because it's very small, but it's easy because it is only one cap. And if you just watch a couple of Tito's videos and a couple of Voltar's videos, they give you the tricks on how to solder SMD components. Just be very, very patient. So yeah, I think, that should be where to start next, but I'm glad to hear that the audio mod is now back up and working. Next up, SL72 wanted to share a 4x2 matrix switch that's compatible with the Xbox Series X in 4K 120, as well as compatible with the ins and outs for a RetroTink 4K. There's two versions that appear to be the same. They purchased the one from Amazon in the UK that is the brand 4K, Fourkay. It's a little cheesy, but the Ori brand is sold on the Amazon US site, and it looks to be the same thing. So no problem with dropouts, works with Mr. Direct video in weird resolutions, works into the OSSC Pro for downscaling. They do still require a separate HDMI splitter for PS3 compatibility, so there's no HDCP stripping on that. And those things almost never have lag, not unless they say there's processing built in. So I think this is one of those rare cases where it's just safe to assume that there's zero lag. If you had a time sleuth, go right ahead. But that is a really good recommendation. I think I'm personally waiting for one that's like 8x4 instead of 4x2, because for me, I would need one HDMI output looped back to the RetroTink, one going directly to my TV, and one going to my receiver, and I guess the fourth for streaming if I need a fourth. But so I would either need an 8x4, or if they have a 4x2 that also supports just a dedicated audio channel and nothing else, that would work as well. And I really want something that's PS3 compatible, because I think that would be a big help in many scenarios. But I'll still share these. However, I do want to make the point that you could buy 10 of these things and 9 of them might not work at all and one would. When you're getting generic rebrand stuff like this, the consistency of manufacturing runs is impossible to track down. So if you do end up buying these, Amazon's great with returns, but test it right away so you don't miss the return period. And that's just with every rebrand product like this. You never quite know what you're going to get. But I appreciate the recommendation, and I think a lot of people might be willing to try it, especially because it's only $150, which, yeah, on the one hand, that's a lot of money to spend on an HDMI switch, but on the other hand, look up 4K 120 HDMI Matrix switches and see what the average cost of that is. And that's why you'll think, oh, okay, I'll drop the $150 and give this thing a try. So thanks for the recommendation. Next up, Alan Ricks wanted to make everybody aware of the Stop Destroying Games initiative from Ross of Ross's Game Dungeon. And it's essentially something that's trying to get publishers to stop just taking away your ability to play a digital game after playing it. So rather than just the servers are down, you can't play it anymore, you're done, have some way to still access that because you've already paid for it. And I like the idea of this. It's going to be a hard one to argue, because any company could also argue that in order for them to keep supporting anything with online play is going to cost them more money than they're making. So as long as the terms of service say that you're only licensing this game for use while the servers are up, they should probably be able to get away with that. But I like where this is going, and I do think that this could be a good thing for other styles of games that don't require servers to be up, only for things like authentication and stuff like that. So I think this is one of those things where it's going to be really hard to find a good solution, but we got to just start trying. So this sounds pretty cool. I'll leave a link to what this is. And, it's way more complicated than a lot of people make it out to be, but hopefully we could find a happy medium for everybody, because the fact is there's just a lot of really cool games, or a lot of games that might have added something and they're just gone. You can't get them unless you're a dirty pirate. So I believe in stuff like this, but it's going to be hard to make things like this work and get them implemented. But I'll leave a link if you're interested. Next up, Tony Lindbergh found an Xbox 360 in the trash room where they live and took it home expecting to just use it as a parts machine. But other than just needing a new belt to eject the DVD drive, it worked perfectly. They left it on for a while. Everything seemed to be fine. So at this point, should they do the preventative maintenance and replace the thermal paste, or should they just kind of leave well enough alone and not touch it? And I think this goes back to whatever your own comfort zone is. So if this was something like a Genesis or a Super Nintendo that I was working on, I would do all the preventative maintenance because I've worked on hundreds of those. And even a mediocre modder like myself could totally handle doing all the stuff that I personally would need to do. But I've never done the thermal paste replacement on a 360. So for me personally, I would not, because I don't know what would happen. And the most important thing when you're modding stuff is, do you know what to do when things go wrong? Because maybe I could get lucky and replace the thermal paste and everything would be perfect. But what happens if I have to troubleshoot something and I don't have expert knowledge of that? That's where I got into things like when I was doing recaps with Jose, I did my monitor, one of my monitors, and my desoldering gun slipped and cut a trace. And that would be a big deal for me. I would need to get a microscope and very carefully get everything together. And he was in the same room. So I was like, dude, I messed up. And 30 seconds later, it was fixed and that was it. So it all comes down, in my opinion, to whatever your skill level is. And if this is something that you've done a whole bunch of before, sure, why not? Then you know what to do if something else goes wrong, applying new thermal paste and doing it right, removing the original, making it very clean, using the right amount of a better quality paste. Yeah, that would absolutely be a good preventative maintenance if that's something that you could easily handle. Also, they want to let everybody know that the final run of Virtual Boy medallions is coming eventually and will be sold by Video Game Perfection. So that's very cool. I will let everybody know when that's available. I don't want to put the post out now because I don't want people banging down your door wondering when they're ready. But basically, the little plastic piece of a Virtual Boy that holds the stands in place often break. So having a metal one would make it so that it would be more steady, and also would last longer. So those were pretty cool. I definitely got one for my Virtual Boy and was very happy that I got it. So I'll let everybody, please let me know so I could let everybody else know when they're up for sale. Next up, Jason Guffey wants to know I could tell them about the different video signal timing standards in the context of playing with custom resolutions for their PC CRT, as well as custom RetroTink 4K resolutions and profiles. And that's one of those things where I just use whatever works for whatever I'm trying to accomplish. So the CVT standards are probably what I would start with, but really just go through and say, all right, I want 800 by 600 at 120 hertz. So go to that website. I'll link to in the description for everybody that's curious. Pop in what you need and then just start with the top and try them and figure out what works for you and what doesn't, and just go from there. And I think if we wanted to really do a discussion of what the differences are and why, I would need to enlist the help of much smarter people than myself, and it would probably be like an hour-long podcast, if not longer, to go into all of this stuff. So I would just say, just only mess with what you need and do whichever one works for you, and you should be fine. Second, for their do-it-yourself SCART extension cables they've been making, is there any reason why they can't simply bridge or jumper the input and output pins of their cables if they only intend to use them for this one use case? Yeah, it depends on what the input and output is going to be plugged into. So that's one of those things where you could do it directionally, where you could only, you could have an input and an output side. That would be fine, because the worst thing that could happen is nothing. You just don't get the signal. But while you should probably be fine, my gut's telling me that's not the best idea because you never know what you're going to run into in the future. And that's the other thing that I always remind people is right now, today, as we're having this discussion, if you make this cable and you plug it in, you're definitely going to remember what you did. But what if 5 years rolls around and you've done a million other projects and you go back to this? Are you going to remember exactly what you did? For me, it's hit or miss, especially whatever else I had going on. If I was working on a million other projects that day and whipped something together, I would probably forget. So that's up to you, but I would either do it unidirectionally or wire it correctly just in case, because I have no problem when the worst thing that could happen is nothing, but the worst thing that could happen is not nothing if you jump them. So just my suggestion. Next up, Reagan Kelly just did a component input mod on a transparent prison CRT, the same one Action Retro just did a video about. Those are very cool. They're clear, so because they don't want people hiding stuff in the CRTs, so there's just these clear plastic cases that show off the insides. It's very neat. But it's a 13-inch TV with a DTV tuner daughter board that's internally connected via YPbPr, so they were able to desolder the tuner and hack on a component input. So far, they've been pretty impressed, but they wondered if I had any thoughts on the mod. Specifically, they found that Genesis works perfectly, but when they connect their Super Famicom, the picture will slowly shift towards purple until it glitches like a sync stutter and goes back to normal. That could be how power is hooked up, but that is absolutely an issue I've seen with transcoders before. So it could be the internal transcoder on that TV is, because remember, all CRTs go to RGB HV or RGB S, depending on the model of the tube and the flyback and all of that stuff. So it would be doing an internal transcoding from component video to RGB. So maybe it's designed only for that DTV tuner, and any other weird signals like the very weird signal in SNES outputs could be messing with it. So that could definitely be an issue. Also, the thing has sound, but it's got a lot of screechy interference at anything but very low volume. Can I think of anything they could try to fix it? You could try to isolate the speaker wires, make sure those are shielded. You could try to make sure that the mod that you did isn't accidentally arcing into or creating interference in other places. Did it do that before the mod? That's certainly something that the first question that I would ask, which I'm not trying to imply that you broke anything. I'm just saying, for me personally, you do a test before, you do a test after, and if something else changes, that's a very easy troubleshooting step. Now you know where to look. And lastly, Action Retro just wired up a component input to the internal YPbPr input. So they did the same, but now they're wondering if they should have added resistors to the input. How might they tell? It seems to be working and getting a decent picture, but they'd rather not blow the thing up. You'd have to put it on an oscilloscope under load to see, but if you're not having an image that's too bright or too dark, it should be okay, because you don't have the sync voltage issue with component video that you do with RGB. So voltage is less of a scare when you're using component video. But in this case, if everything looks right and it's not too bright or too dim, because you would notice if the termination was wrong, it'd either be washed out really bright or super dim where you'd have to jack the brightness all the way up. So if you really cared about this and you wanted to try to make it last as long as possible, grab an oscilloscope to double check what you're getting. Watch that video I did with Steve about testing component video, but it would probably be fine, which I normally don't say that, but this is just one of those weird scenarios that if it works, I can't see too much else going wrong. But once again, if this is really important to you, it's always good to just check. Sir Chicken has some questions concerning 240p or 480i. First, how do they connect an OSSC Pro with an AV output add-on to their PVM via RGB-S or YPbPr? So that's very easy. You just connect that D-sub output to your PVM using one of those cheap D-sub to BNC cables. Just search for VGA to BNC, and that's really it. You could feed, since the RGB lines are on red, green, and blue pins, you could feed either component video or RGB, so that shouldn't be an issue. That's all you would have to do is then just go into the OSSC Pro settings and turn the downscaling mode with the add-on board on, which I believe I showed that in the live stream I did with Marcus, but yeah, that one's pretty easy. Next, how do they get direct video from a Mr. FPGA to said PVM? So it would be HDMI to DAC to D-sub 15, yes, it would be the same. And you could use an HD15 to SCART if you're going to be using other equipment. However, if you're just going into the PVM, that same VGA to BNC output cable would be all that you would need. You would just need to make sure to set the direct video mode and composite sync equals 1 to enable H sync instead of H and V sync. And at that point, all you would need is just a cheap DAC. So both of those are basically plug and play type of solutions that you just need to make sure that your software is set properly, the GUI menu in the OSSC and the Mr. INI file on the Mr. So that's basically it. So let me know if you have any other questions. The only tricky part would be getting component video via direct video Mr., but it doesn't sound like you need that. It sounds like you just need RGBS. So same cable for both would be fine. I'll see if there's a cheap cable I could link to, but if not, any quote unquote VGA to BNC cable should work fine. Next up, Adam Adamant recently did a triple bypass on Genesis, and they were checking the color bars in the 240p test suite and found two middle shades that looked the same. So they found the post on RetroRGB about the pull-down resistors. They got the steps looking fine, except the last two shades look the same now. I checked out the pictures that you sent, and I could tell a difference. And it could be your eyes, it could be the monitor that you're looking at, but I'll leave a link for anybody else. Maybe I'm crazy, but to me, that just seems like your Genesis is slightly hot, which means, here's the best way to put it. If you were to stand at the end of the assembly line at the Sega factory back when these things were made, and you pull all of these out and you put them on a scope with the tools that we have today, no two would be exactly the same. They would range between 650 and 750 millivolts on the RGB colors, and Genesis consoles are usually around 700. So they're usually, the ones that I've tested have been pretty good, but you never know what you're going to get. You could have a wide swing. You could have, some are 690, some are 705, whatever. But that's what you need to expect with any kind of analog video and any kind of consumer product, is you're not going to get them exact. So it could be that if you did this triple bypass on 10 different of the exact same motherboard revision Genesis consoles, you would see those last two color steps more defined in some and closer to each other in others, just based on that console itself. So I'll leave the link to the pictures up if anybody wants to take a look. Maybe I got this one wrong, but if that were me, I would actually call that a win and just enjoy it exactly as is. But anybody else wants to chime in, let me know what you think. Next up, Weijlo recently picked up an internal FDS key from Will's Console Mods for their twin Famicom. And sometimes it loads games, but most of the time it gives an error code 2, which is a battery code. The GitHub mentioned properly grounding the power on pin, but they don't know what they need to do since it was already sold as a kit. They are using a triad power supply, so it's not an issue of lack of power going to the board. So I've never actually installed one of these before, but that does sound like it could be an issue with the kit. Maybe one pin was just soldered slightly off or something like that. You could try to contact Will either through social media or the website or anything like that. But I would also just go through the kit if you have time to and look with a magnifying glass. Are all the points soldered correctly? Do any look like cold joints? Do any look like there's potential shorts? Twist and wiggle the cables. Does it look like any kind of short? Or, when I say twist and wiggle, like don't break anything, but just kind of give it a little bit of a torque and see, does anything flex and touch it? Or does anything come up off the board? I would really first start with a good visual inspection of this thing. Then I would try to get a hold of Will and see, because maybe this is an issue that many people have had that's like, just press this and it's fixed or something like that. So, give that a try and let us know if that still doesn't work. Maybe we could try to track down the issue. Next up are a couple questions from Dustin Mattison, and I have no answers to either. I'm really sorry about this, but I'm going to go through them anyway because one of the questions is silly, and I bet there's some people that are going to want to chime in on the chat for that one. But one, they have a trucker buddy who's going to be on assignment in the Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York State area for a couple months starting in October. Could I recommend any particular diners or all-night spots for good breakfasts? I have never been good at that. Even back when I would do the whole walk to a diner after the bar type of thing, it was always just whatever was open. and I never remember it being good, ever. In fact, I always remember lots of weird vibes from places like that. And, you know, when I'm drunk in public like that, I am very aware. So when I leave a bar where it's completely socially acceptable to be a little bit loud and boisterous, and I go to a diner, I keep my mouth shut. I order my food, I say my please and thank you. I leave too good of a tip because I don't want to accidentally do the math wrong and stiff somebody on a tip. And even with all of that, I still have had some weird vibe, strange things happen, and never had a meal that I ever thought, oh, this is the spot. So for me, it was just whatever was open. During the day, of course, there's a million good places between those 3 states to eat, but in the middle of the night, I got nothing. I very often would default to McDonald's because while I don't consider McDonald's like quality food, for the most part, you know what you're getting. So I don't know. I got nothing on that one. And the other very silly question, I couldn't even think of an answer. I did try, but I'll leave this one to any silly people in the chat. If you got roped into being in a business partnership where you and a bunch of other people decided to open a retro video game and movie themed gentlemen's club, what would you name it? I got nothing, but that was kind of a funny question. Well, that's it for this week. If you have any questions at all, please ask wherever you support in the latest Q&A post. The way these services work, I can't figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, as you saw today, I like just scrolling through and answering the questions in real time as if we were hanging out somewhere, just having a conversation. So any question, just fire away wherever it is that you support. And as you saw today, there's no favorites. Anybody who supports anywhere is always appreciated. And feel free to ask your questions. I just stick with these on the support services. So anyway, as always, thanks to all of you for participating in these. And thanks to anybody who came to Retro World and came over to say hi. I really appreciate all of you. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week.